Welcome to the International Spy Museum Spies and Spymasters Happy Hour. My name is Shana Oltmans. I'm the Exhibitions and Programs Manager at the museum, and tonight we'll be sharing the story of the Cambridge Five. Amanda, Hannah, Mark, Andrew, and I will each tell the story of one of these spies. Now, on to the part you all have been waiting for, the drink. We are joined by Taha from the Round Robin Bar at the Willard in Washington, D.C. Taha, what are you mixing for us?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you again for having us. I'm Taha. I'm the beverage manager at the Willard InterContinental Hotel. We'll be making the Invisible cocktail this evening. This cocktail is inspired by British and London, England inspired. So we're using some London dry gin with some champagne and berry tea. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. First, we'll start with our berry tea, about half an ounce. We'll add our citrus, lemon juice, about half an ounce as well. Do 1 ounce of dry gin. In this case, we're using Tanqueray. We will add ice and give it a good shake. We have our glass here in front of us.
I like the big reveal.
We'll be pouring some champagne into the glass first. We do about 2 ounces. And then we'll go ahead and strain the cocktail right in the champagne. This cocktail is very similar to like a spritz. So you have the spritz from the champagne. We will add our ice. And the fun part is the garnish. Where here we have some blackberries, some raspberry for color, some fresh mint, and last is some dehydrated fruit for the color. Cheers, everyone. And happy birthday, Andrew.
Cheers.
Cheers, thank you.
That looks great. Thank you, Taha. Now, before we focus on each spy, the museum's historian and curator, Andrew Hammond, is going to give a brief overview of the Cambridge Five. Take it away, Andrew.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here with my wonderful colleagues and friends, speaking about the Cambridge Five. So for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to give you 5 facts about the Cambridge Five. So a lot of thought went into the structure of the next 5 minutes, as you can see. Okay, so I think the first thing to say, since this is a happy hour, is that their Soviet handlers saw them as hopeless drunks. They said the Burgess was constantly out of his mind. Philby was a little too fond of the Scotch. So I think there's a lesson in there for all of us. Okay, so they were hopeless drunks. Secondly, I think that one of the most interesting things about them is that all 5 of them were active during World War II. So during World War II, this is when, so a lot of them recruited in the 1930s. The Soviet Union is playing a long game, and they identify these gentlemen for the upper echelons of the British establishment. So they go to Cambridge. So Cambridge and Oxford, if any Martians are tuning in, they have traditionally supplied the upper echelons of the government, the Secret Service, the military, and so forth. And if you don't believe me, have a look at MI6 directors, and you'll have to go back, I think, until the 1970s, 1980s to look for someone that wasn't from what we would call that kind of background. The only exception there is John Cairncross. He was from a more humble background. So there's a great quote by James Jesus Angleton, so the godfather of American counterintelligence. And he says that when he met Kim Philby, intelligence was something he was interested in, but after he met Philby, it was a consuming passion. So we can see some of the connections between the United States and the United Kingdom and the Cambridge Five. So 3 of them, between 1944 and 51, I think, were here in the States. So Philby, Burgess, and Maclean. Okay. And one of the other interesting facts about them, I think, is that only one of them lived to see the fall of the Berlin Wall, lived to see the dissolution of the system that they had been spying on behalf of. I'm not going to give that one away. It's going to gradually unfold with the presentations. You stay tuned and you will find out who that spy was. The second last one that I want to discuss is another great quote, I think. So just touching on the Anglo-American intelligence relationship. So this is from Malcolm Muggeridge, and he said that, so the OSS, so this is the forerunners of the CIA. He said the OSS were deflowered in the frosty old intelligence brothel. The Cambridge Five were 5 of the Johns. They were 5 of the major customers. I think that that's a pretty safe thing to say. And the last thing that I want to say is this can unfold a little bit more as we speak and as we move through this. So there's arguments about who was recruited, when, in what order, who was the most consequential, etc., etc. What we do know for sure, and the way that we're going to unfold tonight, is in the order in which they were uncovered. So just before we go into Mark's discussion, just think of the effect of that. So over the whole course of the Cold War, so 1930s recruited, 1940s during the war, they start climbing up the ladder. In 1951, Burgess and Maclean disappear. They show up in the Soviet Union. So imagine what that's like for British intelligence. 1963, so Philby gets accused, uses his charm to brush them off. 1963, he gets uncovered, and then it goes on like this. Just imagine every 10, 15 years, some new spy is discovered in the heart of the British establishment. And that goes on through the entire duration of the Cold War. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about as we move through the speakers. Think about the effect on the history of the Cold War and the history of the United Kingdom. Over to Mark.
Great, thanks very much. I think we've got the first slide up here. Just real briefly, for those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Mark Stout. I teach intelligence and security studies courses at Johns Hopkins, and I was also the 3rd historian here at the International Spy Museum. So Andrew's predecessor won back from that. So let's start with Donald Maclean. Donald Maclean was born in 1913, the son of a knight who's a Liberal Party member of Parliament and a strict teetotaler, oddly enough. Maclean goes to Cambridge, specifically Trinity College, which you see here. And while there, he joins the Cambridge University Socialist Society and also has a brief sexual fling with Guy Burgess, we'll see again later. And he knew Kim Philby, who was a year ahead of him. So in 34, Maclean graduates with a degree in modern languages and starts to think about working for the Foreign Office, the British equivalent of the State Department. And that spring, Philby invites him to dinner and sounds him out if he'd be interested in maybe, perhaps kind of helping the Soviet Union, and Maclean immediately says yes. So Philby connects him up with an NKVD officer who makes the formal recruitment. The next year then, Maclean applies to the Foreign Office, and at the end of his job interview, one of the interviewers says, hey, we understand you held strong communist views when you were at Cambridge. Do you still hold those views? And Maclean kind of gulps, and then he says, yes, I did have such views, and I haven't entirely shaken them off. But they hire him anyway. So Maclean starts at the Foreign Office in London, where he works on European affairs. And this, of course, is during the period during which Europe is starting its slow slide to World War II. So he's seeing a lot of diplomatic documents that are of great interest to the NKVD. And oddly, the Foreign Office has no rule against taking classified documents home. So Maclean does that. He brings enormous numbers of documents out with him in the evening, meets his case officer who photographs them, and then he returns them back to the office in the morning. 1938, he's transferred to the British Embassy in Paris. And while in Paris, again, he's in a prime position to report on British and French doings as the Czechoslovakia crisis happens, and then when Germany attacks Poland in 1939, starting World War II. Also during this period, he meets Melinda Marling, an American woman who becomes his wife. He marries her actually after the Germans have invaded France, and they spend what would have been their honeymoon basically fleeing the Wehrmacht. And ultimately, they'll have 2 boys and a girl. And interestingly enough, he also tells Melinda very early on that he's a spy, and she just takes that in stride. So back in London now, he continues working on war-related issues for the Foreign Office and reporting to Moscow. And for reasons perhaps we can get into in broader discussion later, Moscow actually loses confidence in him and essentially starts ignoring him for a couple of years, but he carries on. Next slide, please. So, in 1944, he's assigned to the British Embassy in Washington, which you see here, and he'll be there until 48. He works on World War II strategy issues, then US-UK consultations in the early days of the Cold War, and on matters relating to atomic energy, which obviously is a top priority for Soviet intelligence. And then in 48, he's assigned to be number 3 at the British Embassy in Cairo, which proves to be his downfall. The Soviets really aren't interested in Egypt. His case officer has 0 people skills. His marriage is coming under major strain. And on top of this, ever since he took up spying, he's been a problem drinker. But in Cairo, he has just an utter total alcoholic breakdown, and he's sent back to England to recover. And after a period during which the marriage is kind of in limbo, Melinda goes back to England, joins him. He takes some months to recover and then is given a job as head of the Americas department in the Foreign Office. Again, his handlers aren't especially interested in the secrets he can provide there, a lot of Latin America stuff, so he doesn't have much job satisfaction. Meanwhile, a series of clues have led British investigators to take a hard look at him as maybe being a spy, and I'll mention just the 2 main ones. First, in 37, so some years before, a Soviet defector has come out who says there's a spy in the Foreign Office. But he says this spy went to Oxford and is a member of the aristocracy. Maclean went to Cambridge and isn't, in British eyes, a member of the aristocracy, though he probably looked that way to a Soviet. And then second, of course, Venona. The United States intelligence has been intercepting NKVD cables sent during wartime. And in 46, they very painfully, very slowly start to be able to retrospectively decrypt some of these, at least in part. And in 1949, they decrypt a cable from 1945 that shows that a British embassy officer source had reported on a March 1945 meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, and Maclean was at that meeting. Then in 1951, they decrypt the June 1944 cable that says that the source's wife is pregnant, staying with her mother in New York, and that matches Melinda Maclean. So the countdown has started for Donald. MI5 starts following him, reading his mail, tapping his phones in England, and so forth. Then in May 1951, Guy Burgess shows up on his doorstep. He's been serving drunkenly at the British Embassy in Washington alongside Kim Philby. Philby's learned Maclean's in danger, and he sent Burgess to England to give a warning. So Maclean and Burgess flee by ferry to France and then just completely disappear. Next slide, please. There's a big uproar in the British government and the press, unsurprisingly, and Melinda plays innocent, and after a time moves with the kids to Switzerland to get away from the hubbub. And then in 1953, she vanishes too. And of course, she's gone to the Soviet Union to join her husband. 55, Maclean's mysterious disappearance ends when he gives a surprise interview to a Sunday Times reporter who's been sent by Ian Fleming. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Ian Fleming, an interesting guy, to Moscow to pursue other stories. In 61, Maclean joins a Soviet political and economic think tank, which is on the slide here. And while he's in Moscow, his relationship with Melinda goes through a lot of drama, including a period in the 60s when she takes up as Kim Philby's lover. Eventually, she moves back to the United States, where she lives until 2010, talking with nobody about Donald Maclean, except allegedly the FBI, which occasionally has questions for her. Next slide. And then Donald Maclean himself dies in 1983, a couple months shy of his 70th birthday, and with the Soviet Union still apparently going strong. Back to you.
Over to me, I guess. I'm Amanda Ohlke. I'm the Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. And this is a whirlwind overview of Guy Burgess. A lot of you may be familiar with the 1981 play Another Country, or the film made of it in 1984 with like all the cute guys trading the roles between the play and the movie. Rupert Everett, Cary Elwes, all these cute early 80s fellows. The film really focuses on what would have been Guy Bennett, as the character is known, time at Eton. And it suggests that he becomes disenfranchised because of homosexuality and targeted, and then ends up turning to Marxism. Well, the reality is that Guy Burgess is wealthy and popular. He's born in 1911. He's not upper class, but very well-to-do. He goes to Eton. One sadness for him is that his naval career is thwarted by bad eyesight, so he doesn't go on with a naval career, goes to Cambridge, really popular, leading light among the communist students there. And it's fun. Mark and I have been talking this afternoon. There may be some disagreement among your speakers today about things that we are going to say. So get ready for that. Supposedly, according to one great biographer, and I'll show you his book, Stalin's Englishman, terrific book, suggests that Burgess was like so popular. He was a moral leader among this group. The Soviets targeted him, recruited him. He became a talent spotter. He recruited Michael Straight and his lover, or was he? And Anthony Blunt, who you'll hear a little bit more of later. But anyway, he has a great time at Cambridge. And then, next slide, when he leaves Cambridge in 1935, he's casting around for something to do. I should say, oh, he's got lots of lovers. He loves to drink. He's a party fellow. Mark says he's meddlesome. I say he's jolly. Who knows? But definitely, when he lands as a producer at the BBC, he is a heck of a drinker. This image of him on a float, I think, really encapsulates. He's smoking, he's drinking, he's doing all kinds of drugs. His expense reports, you can Google news articles about the expense reports he submits at the BBC that are just like, can you interview someone without spending a fortune on booze? Apparently, Burgess cannot do that. But this is a wonderful opportunity to know everyone as a BBC producer, creating a great network for the Soviets, and he's also a great agent of influence there. Meanwhile, he has been recruited by MI6, and he's working for them, and then gets kicked out of MI6, which is kind of a recurring theme for Burgess, and pops up in 1940 in MI5. So he's with the BBC and serving for one or the other, and he's serving with MI5 during World War II. And you see one of the dear memories of a fellow MI5 officer there. I don't know what it's like in Gibraltar, but apparently the bar is high for drinking a lot. So he, after the war, becomes the secretary to Hector McNeill, member of parliament. He's number 2 in the Foreign Office from 46 to 48. Here you see a document from our collection signed by Burgess. It's a letter that was sent to McNeill at that time. What Burgess does here is he transfers 5,000 documents to the Soviets, and the material is so good that apparently Stalin thought he was phony and was a triple agent because it was so good. So this is when he moves a lot of information over to the Soviets. He then goes on to be independently Foreign Service officer. He's an expert on communist China, and some see his fingerprints all over the fact that Britain recognizes communist China about 30 years before the United States does. Anyway, he's beginning to unravel, and in 1950, he's sent to DC. He stays in the magnificent house you see pictured there. That's the Philby's residence, and he lives with the Philbys for a year. That's on Nebraska Avenue, not far from here. And then he is a wreck. He's drunk everything. People just say he's a mess. He's been pulled over with, you know, people of color who are homosexual, and he just pushes it too far. And he's told to go back. He's done. He's got to go back to the UK, and it lines up perfectly with warning Maclean that it's time to go. And they basically disappear, as Mark references, and no one knows where they've gone. This is a newspaper article from our collection that talks about one of the theories. They're just cruising in the Mediterranean. Like sometimes Hannah, Shana, and I just disappear, and no one knows where we are, and we're just cruising in the Mediterranean. But that was before the pandemic. So next slide, because where were they really? Of course, they were in the USSR. And eventually, you know, about 4 or 5 years later, when that becomes obvious, Khrushchev admits that Burgess is working for a publisher. He's actually advising the Soviets on British foreign opinion, but he's drinking like crazy. He's still got plenty of money. He has his paintings. People come to visit him. He continues with that lifestyle. But he seems bored, and he ends up dying very young, I think at 52 in 1963. And that is the end of Guy Burgess.
Okay, so on to the third man, so Kim Philby. So in this picture here, this is to me, this captures something of the essence of Kim Philby. You see him there, a nice, well-tailored suit, his hair done really well, charming smile, lighting up the room. So you may be tempted to think that this is his daughter's wedding or his birthday party. This is actually him fending off accusations that he is the third man. So he gathers all the press, if I remember correctly, in his mother's house, and he holds forth. And his Soviet handler says that his performance was, quote, breathtaking, unquote. So someone that could light up the room, someone that was charismatic. So I mentioned earlier, James Jesus Angleton, the father of American counterintelligence, he was taken in by Kim Philby. So was the MI6 officer, Nicholas Elliott. People looked up to Philby. People felt better by being in his company. And what you see here is also interesting because he said that one of his tactics for dealing with interrogation is when someone says to you, this was the case and this was the case and this was the case, don't you find that strange? You just double down. You just say, do you know what? You're jolly well right. That is strange. I don't know what on earth could possibly explain that. So maybe there's also a takeaway in there for you all. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's walk back a little bit. So Kim Philby, born in 1912. This is his father on the left, St. Philby. So it's spelled like Saint John, St. John, but pronounced St. Philby, also known as Sheikh Abdullah. So his father was a bit of an eccentric spoke multiple languages, and like Kim Philby, and like many members of the British governing elites, St John Philby went to Westminster School and then Trinity College, Cambridge. Kim Philby followed exactly the same path. So Kim, when he's at Cambridge, and in the period immediately afterwards, he gets recruited to work on behalf of the Soviet Union. And what a remarkable career he had. He found himself constantly in these positions where he was so well placed to give vital information to the Soviet Union, whether that be as the Anglo-American liaison officer, whether that be as the head of counterintelligence for, yes, you've guessed it, the Soviet Union and MI6. So he kept finding himself in these positions. He was quoted as reporting on his colleagues with waspish precision. So the whole course of his career, he's giving great pen portraits of his colleagues, of the bureaucracy. His writing is a model of lucidity and economy. So if anybody's ever read Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, kind of like that, very economical with language and very clear. Okay, so in 1955, as we just saw, the net seems to be closing around him, and partly it comes on the back of the two people we've just heard about. So he's in various ways associated with Maclean and Burgess. The light of suspicion gets cast on him. He leaves MI6, goes back to journalism. He ends up living in Beirut. Nicholas Elliott, one of his best friends, goes out to confront him in 1963. Philby gives up and then boards a freighter bound for the Ukraine and then resurfaces not long afterwards in Moscow. So following in the same path of Burgess and Maclean. And I think one of the interesting things about Kim Philby is that he exploited and took advantage of one of the blind spots in the United Kingdom, and that is the relationship between these institutions, the types of people who attend these institutions, and the people that populate the upper echelons of the organs of the state. So you hear about the vetting process for Philby joining. Basically, one of his father's friends vouches for him and says, I know his people, he's one of us. If anybody's applying for the CIA just now or MI6, you will be very jealous of that recruiting process, I'm sure. I'm sure there's a lot more involved these days, but that was what went on. But it seemed inconceivable that one of us would turn out to be someone else. So on to the next slide, please. So we see here Philby in 1981, so after he's defected, this is him in East Germany giving an address in 1981, and he's basically boasting about what he'd done. On the left here, I couldn't help but include them because we're speaking about a quintessential Englishman. We see in the top left the tweed trilby hat, and we see the pipe on the bottom, and again there from our fantastic collection, as is the photograph. Move on to the next slide, please. And here we see what I think is a really fascinating photograph. So this is Kim Philby in 1988. So If you're still trying to work out who sees the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we're 3 down, so there can only be one of the other 2 left. He died in 1988, so just a year before, around 18 months before the Berlin Wall falls. I think this photograph is fascinating. It's pathetic and tragic. Here is a man that reported on his wife, his friends, his colleagues, on behalf of an entity that would be defunct 2-3 years after he dies. And he never gets to see it. He never lives to see it. And I think that to the end, Kim Philby died deceiving himself, just as he lived a life of deception. And this is a personal take. He deceived himself. So I want to give you, so we heard about Philby's waspish precision on reporting on his colleagues. This is him on the head of MI6, Sir Stuart Menzies. He says, his knowledge of the world and views about it were just what one would expect from a fairly cloistered son of the British establishment. Philby was writing about Sir Stuart Menzies that could have been his epitaph. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see, can you hear me? My story actually starts here. And I'm going to say something that I didn't tell Mark or Andrew I was going to say, but Amanda and Shana know this. I firmly believe in the last year or so that Anthony Blunt, who is who I'm talking about, has become the gateway Cambridge spy for the rest of the world to learn about the Cambridge Five. And that is because of one thing, The Crown. If you've watched The Crown on Netflix, if you've watched season 3, episode 1, you get Samuel West playing Blunt in the episode. This is actually his second time playing Blunt. He played him in a BBC miniseries, The Cambridge Spies. So I stand by that. Most people probably know Blunt's name now over Philby's strictly because of this episode. And I know those are fighting words, but I will go down. Thank you. Yes, The Crown. So that episode actually does get some things correct, like the fact this is actually Anthony Blunt next to Samuel West. He was the surveyor of the Queen's pictures. That is basically the curator, and you take care of the care and maintenance of the Queen's royal collection. He is a well-known art historian. Actually, if you take art history courses, you probably will read one of his books at some point. They are still considered some of the most pivotal books in art history. But his story actually starts a little sooner. Oh, hang on, sorry, here's a picture of him and the Queen. So they were going around that first scene. If you rewatch that episode, pay attention to the language at the beginning, because they set it up as if the Prime Minister is going to be the spy. Not true. And even how the script is written, the character who's playing Blunt, hints at the fact that maybe he was young, maybe he didn't know who he was, and all kinds of stuff. And then eventually the episode turns and you find out. So my story actually is going to start on November of 1979, when Margaret Thatcher reveals that Blunt is the 4th man of the Cambridge spy ring. Big shocking news to the world, not so shocking to those who knew, because actually years sooner in 1964, Blunt had confessed. He had secretly confessed after an American who he had recruited into being a KGB spy admitted and confessed that Blunt was the one who recruited him. Now, couple things. When Blunt confesses in 1964, excuse me, he had actually been interviewed 11 times prior about, spy rings, Maclean, Burgess, all these people, and at no point does he admit it. It is not until this American spy that they finally have the proof. He sits down, they say he has a long drink, clearly drinking's a theme here, looks out the window and finally confesses that he was a recruiter. Yes, cheers. Of the Cambridge spy ring. So he confesses, he gets full immunity, he gets to stay the curator of the Queen's collection, and everyone just kind of buttons their lip. Andrew, you had mentioned, like, isn't that an easy way if you're applying for CIA? Well, turns out if you're a traitor and you are friends with the upper echelons, you also just get to keep your job and, you know, continue on until Margaret Thatcher finds out and she nationally says it. So 5 days after that initial revelation, he does an interview live on TV. It's on the BBC. You can actually find it online. It's, if you look on, like, if you YouTube it, you can watch the whole thing. And my favorite quote from it is they ask him, how do you feel about being called a traitor now? And he says, I can't deny it. What he did is he was the main recruiter. He also helped Maclean and Burgess. Amanda and Mark both talked about this when they left England. He actually used his MI5 contact days from World War II to get them out and into Russia. So he constantly had the spotlight on him, as well as being in a very high established position in Buckingham Palace, and never really gave it away. So I think Blunt is the coolest of the Cambridge spies, only really because of the crown right now. But that being said, the next one is not going to be discovered until, oh, I should say this, sorry, this goes on to Andrew's thing. After Blunt is revealed as spy, he had been Sir Anthony Blunt. His knighthood is taken away right away from the Queen. The Queen has never publicly acknowledged or talked about if she knew about him being a spy. I'm not going to say anything because that's a powerful family. And more importantly, he passes away 3 years after in shame. So there was talk, actually, if you read articles right around the time he's revealed, people had thought he had left England already. He didn't. He just kind of went into hiding in his house, stayed there for 3 more years, and eventually passes away, which means my guy also doesn't make the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm gonna leave that to Shana. Oh, and you guys get to see my beautiful background. Sorry about that.
I just thought it was part of your presentation.
No, that is my favorite piece of art. You can just keep going.
All right, thank you. So, John Cairncross, yes, he does survive to see the fall of the Berlin Wall. He is probably the least well-known of the Cambridge Five. Until a year ago, there actually wasn't even really a dedicated biography on him, but within the last year or so, 2 have come out, which are both on that slide. And his most popular depiction in fiction is probably in the 2014 film, The Imitation Game, where he's portrayed as one of the crypt analysts working closely with Alan Turing, who actually ends up blackmailing Turing in the film. And that's the center photo there, still from that film. But in reality, while Cairncross did do some work in Bletchley Park, he actually worked as a translator, and so he most likely never would have actually interacted with Turing. So what's the true story about this reported 5th man? Well, John Cairncross, he has a different background than these other spies. He came from a less affluent upbringing. He was born in 1913 to a lower middle class family. He grew up in a small mining and farming community in Scotland, and he wasn't exposed to that same life of privilege as these other spies. And that feeling of not quite fitting in, not quite being accepted by the British aristocratic and upper middle classes, that would affect him pretty much his whole life. He also wasn't quite as, I would say, maybe social or friendly or as well liked as some of these other spies we've heard about. And many of them, when they talk about Cairncross, they don't typically talk about him in a particularly positive light as someone they'd want to hang out with. But he ended up entering Cambridge in 1934. He was incredibly smart, really good at languages. He was fluent in a number of languages, German, French, Italian, Spanish, just to name a few. And after he graduated in 1936, he actually really wanted to pursue a career in academia, but it didn't work out. So instead, he turned to the civil service, where he began working in the Foreign Office. And it's while he's at the Foreign Office that he is first recruited. He had known Blunt while at Cambridge, and Blunt had recommended him to Burgess as a potential recruit. So he's recruited in 1937, and he has about a 15-year career of spying for the Soviets. And he had access to many of the most critical establishments in Britain. And he ended up supplying thousands and thousands of pages of documents. Hannah, if you'll go to the next slide, you can see how many areas he was involved in. The image on the left is of Cairncross there, and then the two images on the right are his canceled British passport, which we also have in our collection. And so it's during this period of 15 years where he is serving in the Foreign Office, the Treasury, Bletchley Park, MI6, and the Ministry of Supply. So he really kind of is in all these different areas. He doesn't get to a particularly high level. He's normally at a junior level, but he still has access to tons of documents. And the KGB alleged that he passed information onto them about defense research and development, intelligence related to Ultra, which was the information coming out of the code breaking that was happening at Bletchley Park, details on MI6 activities, and additionally, information about Britain's early preparations to build atomic weapons. And that information the Soviets were very interested in. Of course, Cairncross denies a lot of this. He does admit that he passed it information about Ultra, but he, until he dies, is always denying ever passing any information about atomic secrets. So why did he spy? He always claims, and I think this is definitely true, most historians agree, that he was strongly anti-Nazi. He really felt that Britain needed to work with the Soviets to defeat the Nazis. Basically, if the Soviet Union went down, Britain would follow. And that was always really how he justified what he was doing. Some historians also argue it could have also been a little bit of that feeling of not belonging with that upper class and some of his treatment during his professional career as well. But his spying career ended in 1951, shortly after Maclean and Burgess disappear. He comes under suspicion by British officials just due to his contact with them. But similar to Blunt, he's not really charged with anything. He just has to leave the civil service. So he spends the rest of his life living around the world, Rome, Geneva, Bangkok, even Ohio. And he mostly worked as a translator, an editor, and he published a number of books. Because again, academia was really what he kind of always wanted to do. But he attracts MI5's attention again in 1964. They interview him again, and this time he does confess to passing some intelligence to the Soviets. But he always claims it was purely to help the British defeat the Nazis. This interview is unofficial, so they can't necessarily use it to charge him. They don't really have quite enough evidence as well. So they decide the case would be very difficult. Again, it'd be embarrassing for the British. So they just kind of, swipe it under the rug. But they do continue to interview him over the years. And one of the people who interviewed him was a Spy Museum board member, Dame Stella Remington, who went on to be the first woman to become Director General of the Security Service. So he kind of is under the radar, it's forgotten, but in 1979, when Blunt was named as the fourth man, Cairncross is first publicly exposed with the Sunday Times article. Doesn't have much information, but his name is out there. And then in 1990, he really is exposed with everything he had been doing when Christopher Andrew and the KGB defector Olev Kuryevsky published the KGB, the inside story of its foreign operations from Lenin to Gorbachev, which claimed Cairncross had leaked information about atomic weapons and that he was the all-important fifth man. This spurred Cairncross to want to tell his side of the story, which he continues to claim he had never passed atomic secrets. And so he wrote his autobiography, The Enigma Spy, which was published in 1997, which was just a couple years after his death in 1995. So that is the story of our 5 Cambridge spies. So I'm going to look at some questions because I know I saw a ton coming in. So my first question that I have here is a really great question to start us off, I think. Did the Soviets really find any of this information useful? They're getting all this info. Was it good? What do you guys think?
Well, I've got to fall back on the interesting, like, it was so good, we are discounting it. So that but I don't know, I want to hear other people's thoughts.
Andy, do you have thoughts on this? Or Andrew, I apologize. Do you have thoughts on this? I've got one or two, but I'll let you go first if you want in.
It's all good. Yeah, I don't know if you want to speak a bit more about this, Shana, but I know that Cairncross, some of the intelligence that he was passing is generally seen as having been very important in the Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front. And also, if I remember correctly, some of the intelligence let the Soviet Union know that Japan was not going to attack it, so it could send divisions from the east to the west. And you know, the Germans came very close to you know, winning on the Eastern Front. And so, you know, who knows? That's just one example. Sorry.
No, that was great. I will say, and some of when I was reading, it was similar. I know, Amanda, you mentioned this, where he was providing so much information. The Soviets felt like this can't be true. They must be like playing us. And I think that was the case with a lot of the information that Cairncross also provided. And additionally, he was involved in all of these different agencies, but they were able to get access from additional people as well. So at least for, you know, Cairncross's position, it seemed like they had access from other people. So it wasn't necessarily that if he wasn't there, they wouldn't have had that, because there seemed to be some duplications there as well. But you're absolutely right, Andrew, that one battle was kind of his shining moment of intelligence that was provided.
A couple of very quick thoughts as well. So Maclean did provide information on, I don't know about nuclear weapons per se, but certainly on atomic power, nuclear power. In fact, he had an all access pass to the Atomic Energy Commission in Washington, which even his boss didn't have. Also, you know, in the run up to World War II, the Soviet Union felt themselves sort of very vulnerable and in a potentially very exposed position. I mean, they were not ready to fight a war with Nazi Germany. They needed to, you know, maneuver very carefully there. And so his information about the sort of diplomatic behind-the-scenes machinations and what was going on at Munich and all that sort of stuff was very super interesting and useful to Moscow. And the third thing I'd say is, and I know this applies to Maclean, I believe it applies to all five. I mean, we don't know exactly everything they did pass. Right? You know, we know bits and pieces of what they passed, some of which are probably more important and some of which are probably less important. But we're talking about an enormous volume of stuff and only a tiny little soda straw look at what they actually gave. So it's hard to make up sort of, I think, full judgment.
And when you think about, you know, Burgess as an agent of influence, that's a whole other different ballpark, knowing people and just in conversation, all of these people, the Queen's surveyor of art, you know, drops a friendly comment to the Queen, you know, what's that worth?
Absolutely. All right. So the next question, did the Cambridge Spies scandal change the recruiting process? When did the selection of agents be less based on nepotism and social ties?
Don't just all jump at that.
Sorry. Sorry, it went quiet on my computer for a second.
The question was about nepotism. Has that stopped, Mark?
I can't speak to Britain. I think Andrew mentioned in passing, and it's certainly something that was a fairly rapid response to the Burgess and Maclean defection, that the vetting process, in American terms, the security clearance process that you had to go through, you know, at least in the Foreign Office, and I believe in MI5 and MI6 as well, and became much more rigorous as immediate result of the defection of Burgess and Maclean. I'm not a big expert on the role of class and the British government and how that's evolved over time, so that I can't speak to. But the vetting process got tightened up like pronto.
Wait, I want to say one thing that Mark actually led me on to. There was a tweet that came out recently from another historian who, after Blunt was publicly acknowledged, they did Mark, you might have to correct me here, it was like an investigation on like 20 years of British schools and seeing how Russia had pulled them. I'm blanking on it completely because we talked about it a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, thank you for the reminder. Yeah, so after Burgess and Maclean defected, the MI5, this is in Christopher Andrews' authorized history of MI5, MI5 looked at everybody who was known to have been a communist who'd gone to any British university between, and I don't have this part right, but something like 1920 and 1950 or something along those lines, and looked at every single one of them. And apparently found no additional spies. Doesn't mean there weren't any. There might have been one or two who slipped through, but they took a comprehensive look, and because this was, as Andrew noted in his introduction, I mean, this was just so appalling. I mean, it got off to a bad start in '51, and then there was just this continuous trickle. So it was a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, like Blunt, they even knew had Marxist views, and they're like, oh, he's not that much of a threat. Like, it's in the document, like, oh, we knew, but it's fine.
Well, that's one of the interesting things with Maclean, too, is that particularly when he'd been drinking, he was perfectly happy to say, yeah, I'm a communist. And even in the late months, he like confessed at least once in public to being the British Alger Hiss, i.e. being a Soviet spy. And like everybody would go, ah, ha, 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 he's drunk, and sort of carry on.
We were in the same, the OSS, Oh So Social. I mean, it seems like people are like, well, who do we trust? We trust people who are just like us. Maybe not such a great man.
Yeah, well, one example that speaks to the question. So I was rereading this in preparation for tonight's Spy Catcher, and Philby is the ghost that haunts this book. And Peter Wright speaks about observing MI6's interrogation of Philby, and they basically ask him questions, and when he gets in trouble, they just say, oh yeah, but you probably just got confused or something, right? And he says, oh yeah, you're right, and then they move on. So again, this blind spot, I think, in British society, where it just seemed unbelievable that someone like Philby could do what he done. I think that was something that continued to be exploited and taken advantage of. And in the American context, again, just to go back to James Jesus Angleton, so the godfather of American counterintelligence, some historians say that he became extremely paranoid. He went on counterproductive witch hunts in the CIA. And part of this is because he was betrayed by Kim Philby, someone that he looked up to. Some people have said that towards the end of his career, he would just be mumbling, "It was Kim, it was Kim." He saw Philby's ghost everywhere as well. So that's one of the things that I personally find interesting about Philby.
Andrew, is the quote true, "If you can't belong, betray," as attributed to Philby?
That one I'm not sure on. There's so many great quotes, but I can certainly look it up.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of reference to that, why you're not quite of the system, but he sure seems like he was part of the system.
So we've got another great question here, which we haven't touched on, so I think this is perfect. How much interaction was there among the 5 spies? Who wants to start?
Well, Burgess was staying at Philby's house for a year, so.
How did Philby feel about that?
I'm sure it was messy. I got a feeling there were like bottles and cigarette butts and lovers draped all over the place, but.
I will say that Cairncross when he talked about it, he, didn't consider himself the fifth man. He knew all of them. He either had met them briefly. He wasn't particularly close, but he wasn't necessarily working with them in a group or in any coordinated way. There were moments where I think when he's at MI6, Philby has passed on a document or information, and he passes the same thing, and he doesn't even know that Philby is necessarily a spy. So for him, he really saw himself as not a part of this spy ring in that way, but working more independently.
Yeah, and to support that, I mean, my impression is that from Maclean's point of view, he was only sort of glancingly aware of Cairncross. Certainly, Cairncross didn't play a big role in either his personal life, his overt professional life, or his clandestine professional life either. Whereas he had very, close connections, off and on over time, but very close connections with Philby and Burgess. Though after he defected in Moscow, he and Burgess didn't actually hang out a whole lot together. And in fact, and after Philby stole his wife, albeit temporarily, he didn't hang out much with Philby either. He apparently became best buddies with George Blake, yet another very important British spy who was not one of the Cambridge Five, but who was doing a number on British intelligence in the 1950s. So there was quite the community in Moscow there. I saw a cartoon from, I don't know, some British newspaper, I think after Philby defected, and it had sort of, two British gentlemen, obviously, in London, and they're looking at the news about, Philby defection, and they're making some sort of comment about how, Moscow will soon have enough Brits to form a cricket team. So.
Well, Burgess did leave his books to Philby upon his death, apparently. And then Hannah and I have our dukes up because I say that Burgess and Blunt were lovers at Cambridge. And what does Hannah say?
I say no, because Blunt wrote his memoirs, and they were released 25 years after his death. I believe they were released in 2009. And he adamantly claims that they were not lovers. Claims.
They were lovers. Okay, next question.
Yeah.
All right. So this one will be kind of interesting. Who was the most ideologically driven, would we say? How would we rank these five? What do you guys think? I think Cairncross is towards the end of less ideological in terms of supporting communism.
Andrew, thoughts on that?
I think Philby would be more at the most committed. One of the interesting things about Philby was that he jettisoned his beliefs, at least on the surface, and then he carried on those beliefs in a kind of internal communion with himself, which is quite a feat of self-discipline for quite a long period of time. And then they really only come back out again when he pops up in Moscow. And you see that speech, of course, that he gave in 1981.
I think Maclean was quite committed. His big struggle was with the practicalities, the business of espionage. That drove him right around the bend, and he thought that being a spy was really grubby business, at which at one point he compared to cleaning toilets. Well, somebody's, it's important and somebody has to do it. And boy, it really sucks that it has to be me, but I'm gonna, because I think the cause is really important. Amanda, I'm curious if Burgess believed in anything.
Well, Burgess actually did believe, and he was committed, and he actually gathered a very fine parade during his time at Cambridge in support of communism. He did ride along in his car with that, apparently, rather than walking. And I think that's a little bit what Burgess was like. He was committed, and he ended up defecting. Philby had said, don't go along with Maclean, but he did. The jig was kind of up, but he didn't really have any stakes because he was well-to-do, and so he could, have these beliefs without them really affecting him materially. But I think he was committed as much as, he could be.
I'm going to say Blunt was neutral. even in his interview, he talks about how he admits what he did is wrong, and he talks about how, you know, when he was young, it was his conscience over country, and at the time, conscience for him was more important than country and what he was believing. Yeah, he's such a weird closed book because you only learn about some stuff, and it's 15 years of him getting his story together, which is, I think, the craziest part. It's not like one moment. It's you've been caught, everyone knows. You've got 15 years till you are truly publicly acknowledged.
I want to say one other thing. Sorry, Shana, before you, I do think a lot of them wanted to balance the power. They thought, you know, U.S., Soviet Union, and they wanted to balance the power a bit. So that's why they were. So I think Burgess fell into that camp.
All right, so this is the final question because I think we can have quick answers. Is there a movie or TV show that has the best portrayal of the Cambridge Five, or just one of the five that we recommend, or that's our favorite? Do any of you guys have a favorite?
The Crown. I mentioned it earlier. Also, Mark, I didn't know about it. There's a movie called The Fourth Man, or TV series that you can watch all in one go, called The Fourth Man, about Blunt. But on the cover is a very young Anthony Hopkins. It is not Hopkins who plays Blunt. So that's a little bit of a trick. And that one's pretty good too. But
I think for me it would be Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I think the movie with Gary Oldman was fantastic, and I could also strongly recommend the original BBC with Alec Guinness BBC show. And of course it's fiction, but just like I said, Philby was the ghost that haunted the book Spycatcher and the ghost that haunted the career of James Jesus Angleton. You could also say he's the ghost that haunts Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and probably the Cambridge Five. And of course, John le Carré was an ex-intelligence officer.
Another country's nice to look at.
Well, wonderful. Well, we are, our hour is up. So I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Mark, thank you for being our special guest and joining us. Thank you to Taha and the Round Robin Bar for making that delicious, delicious drink. We have a number of programs coming up. Check our website. Our next program will be next Thursday at 6:30, so it's a little bit later Eastern, and that is with Richard Diaz. Diaz actually lost his arm in a car accident and went on to become the first officer in CIA history with this specific disability to become a case officer. So that's going to be a really wonderful program with him as our guest. And then finally, if you're enjoying these programs, please consider making a contribution. Now through the end of the year, your donation will be matched by a generous anonymous donor. That means your donation of $20 or $200 will become $40 or $400. So please consider donating if you're able to. And thank you again for being here. We hope to see you soon. And of course, cheers. Oh, Amanda, yes.
I want to say the Spy Museum is open, which you probably know, but the Round Robin Bar is closed, as you could see, which is tragic. But the Willard's Le Parc Bistro is open, and I hear you can get that drink there, which I'm going to mask up and try. Sorry. So just
that's important intel. So thank you all for being here, and cheers.
Cheers.